Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Michelanne Forster's play Te Keni, which is a play about the early English, not necessarily conquest, but the sort of pre-conquest stages of New Zealand. The missionary phases in which British Christian missionaries came to New Zealand and attempted to convert the native population of Maori to Christianity, which was not entirely successful. But one of the big things that the play deals with is the sort of difficulty of intercultural connections, of establishing links between the Maori culture and the British culture. And a lot of those difficulties come from the inability or the unwillingness to understand how the other side sees the world, how the other side values things, etc., etc. And the primary character, the main sort of focus of the play, is the missionary. What's his first name? Richard, I think. No, Thomas Kendall. Sorry, Richard is a different character. Thomas Kendall, who is sent by this missionary society to basically learn and create a dictionary of the Maori language. Kendall becomes increasingly sort of sympathetic to the Maori and drawn into their culture, much to the displeasure of the missionary leaders, Marsden and Butler, who want him to go and make the Maori Christian and not really have any particular respect for Maori culture, tradition, religion, belief, etc., etc. And so that's the central conflict of the play. Alongside this, there's a practical conflict related to the fact that the Maori want muskets. And actually, this is an interesting part of early New Zealand history, because one of the main reasons the Maori were never wiped out or conquered in the way that Australian Aborigines or most Native Americans, First Nations, Canadians, etc., were, is because very, very quickly the Maori recognized the significance of muskets, and they made those their primary trade goal. So the Maori very quickly accumulated large numbers of muskets, which they largely used in warfare against other Maori tribes, nations, kingdoms. So there was a lot of inter-tribal conflict between the Maori with these muskets that they had gotten. But because they spent time fighting one another, the Maori very quickly learned to use muskets very effectively in the New Zealand terrain. And so when the British actually brought in the British military, or units of the British military, to try and subdue the Maori actually had better tactics for fighting in the jungles and hills of New Zealand than the British did. And there was a whole series of early to mid 18th century, or 19th century, wars called the Musket Wars, where the Maori fought one another and they fought the British. And it was one of the most successful indigenous resistance movements to British colonialism in the entire history of the British Empire, because the Maori recognized the significance of muskets and learned to use them by fighting amongst themselves. And so Kendall is very willing, much more willing than his superiors would want him to be, to trade muskets for information and for food and animals and things like this. So Kendall ends up supplying a lot of guns to the Maori especially Hongi, the chief that he is his primary contact person. And the missionary society is never pleased with this. So again, we have these sort of cultural conflicts because the Maori want weapons so that they can fight one another, because that's a key component of their traditional culture. The missionary society, on the other hand, wants them to switch to agriculture, which the Maori are not super keen on. And so we have these sort of disjunctions of objectives. Now, there's a lot of interesting stuff in the play, and I'm going to only touch on a few things that I think are particularly interesting. The first two I'm going to touch on fairly briefly. One that comes near the end. This is scene 8 of, I think it's Act 2. No, Act 3. Sorry. Scene 8 of Act 3. Marsden is talking to Hongi. Kendall has largely fallen from grace at this point. He's been thrown out of the missionary society. He's basically lost his wife. He doesn't have access to any more muskets or anything, so he's not that much use to Hongi at this point. But Marsden says here, the society won't take him back. Mr. Butler says he's threatening to burn down the school. I'll have to call soldiers from Port Jackson if he carries on like this. Then Hongi says, no soldiers here. They'll take our land. Marsden says, who told you that? Hongi says, I saw it in a dream, soldiers with red coats and muskets. And Marsden says, that's utter nonsense. British soldiers will never take your land by force. You've nothing to fear on that score. And then they go on for a little bit. But that's an interesting bit, because that's one of the things that we know was not... That's one of the promises we know was not kept. In fact, British soldiers did end up coming to New Zealand, and they did end up fighting the Maori to try and take possession of the land. But that's sort of one of the myths that early proto-colonial missionaries often clung to, is this idea that colonialism didn't need to be a military endeavor, even though history repeatedly has shown that it does. So there's that. That's really an interesting bit. There's this other component that I find really striking that I want to talk about just very briefly. This is the beginning of scene 7 in Act... I want to say Act 1? I think. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Scene 7, Act 1. Kendall, like I said, his job is to study the Maori language and create a dictionary of Maori terms. So at the beginning of scene 7, he's talking to his wife. He says, the longer I'm here, the more I understand, the more certain I become. There is a connection. Jane says, what connection? Kendall says, these New Zealanders may indeed be the lost tribe of Israel. Jane says, oh, come, Thomas. Kendall says, it's possible, Mrs. Kendall. All things are possible. Jane says, if they're the lost tribe, why don't they speak Hebrew? Kendall says, their tongue's been corrupted over thousands and thousands of years, but the roots of both languages have great similarities. The trail is here if only I could follow it. And then later in the play, there's another reference to him trying to establish connections between the Maori and the lost tribes of Israel. And that's interesting because that was actually a big thing in the early colonial history of New Zealand, was this idea that the Maori were somehow connected to the Jews. And there was a hybrid religion that developed in the 1830s, created by a guy named Penitana Papahurahiri, which I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right. I don't speak Maori. And he called himself Te Atua Wera, which means the fiery god. And this was a syncretic religion combining Old Testament philosophy and prophecy and ideas, the religious beliefs of Judaism with Maori animistic religion and Maori mythology. So it combined these two things, and Papahurahiri developed a very large following. I mean, he was a major religious leader, and he actually led resistance movements to British colonialism from this religious perspective. So again, we've got these very interesting small bits of New Zealand history tucked into the larger story of this early phase of New Zealand history. But the other thing that I want to talk about with this play is the way that a Maori language is used. One of the things that Forster mentions in the introduction to this play, where she talks about how she approached writing it, is that she was inspired by Brian Friel's play Translations, which deals with some similar issues. 1700s, I think, into the early 1800s, of English people coming to Ireland and basically anglicizing or completely renaming places in Ireland. So what Friel does and what Forster does here is, well, I'll talk specifically about what Forster does here, because what she does is really designed so that English language, Anglophone theater audiences can follow the story. So when, for instance, Kendall is talking to the Maori, he speaks in English, and then Hongi translates it. So we get, this is in Act 1, Scene 1, we start with a sort of large get-together where Kendall addresses the Maori, telling them about God, telling them about the Bible, telling them about Christianity, etc., etc. And basically he gives these various statements and Hongi translates them. But when the Maori speak among themselves, the Maori characters speak among themselves, they speak English, and what Forster says is that the audience is supposed to suspend their disbelief and accept that the Maori characters are speaking to one another in Maori. So we get that component. Like when Waikato and Hongi talk to one another, the actors speak English, but the characters would be speaking Maori. So again, this is a technique that allows Forster, who's an Anglophone playwright, an English language playwright, who admits that she doesn't speak Maori, it allows her to make the play meaningful for Anglophone audiences who can only be expected to understand English, while still gesturing toward the difference between the Maori, their language, their culture, and the English or the British and their language and their culture.